Welcome to Lecture 23 of Introduction to Fine Arts. This week we'll discuss the material included in Chapter 16 of your textbook, Modernism. It's an odd chapter title. As we've seen, art styles had already become modernist by this point. And it's a rather unfortunate time designation. Basically World War I through the start of World War II, 1914 to 1940-ish. And we are today still dealing with the changes that World War I wrought. There's perhaps no greater contrast than the difference between the world that entered World War I and the world that emerged afterward. In 1914, armies looked a lot like Napoleon's army from 100 years before, or a bit like the Redcoats in the American Revolutionary War. They were hopelessly unprepared for the type of battle they would be fighting. The machine age meant qualitatively different weaponry. At the beginning, the French army was just trying to carry out cavalry maneuvers in a hail of machine gun fire. There was an utterly complete inability of the generals to understand the technological changes and what that meant for warfighting. The Battle of the Frontiers breaks out at the start of the war, the Germans versus the French. It becomes a trench war of attrition, because the defense really has the upper hand with machine guns. Basically, the battle was fought to a stalemate. And there they were. Life in the trenches was unimaginably horrible. In fact, more soldiers died from the Spanish flu than by any of the bullets that were exchanged. And in addition to that pure misery, armies would often lose tens of thousands of soldiers just to gain a half a mile of territory. And it was anonymous death, just from out of nowhere. These poor men had read books about heroic fighting of soldiers in the past, and this was nothing like that. By the end of the war, in 1918, armies were totally transformed. Soldiers looked sort of like they do today, at least they're recognizably modern. The Great War swept away the old world, brought down Europe's greatest empires. Here's Europe at the start of the war. You see the Russian Empire there? It didn't even make it through the war. The Bolsheviks took over. There would be no Cold War without World War I. Germany was plunged into depression, which made it ripe for World War II. Britain's empire days are over after World War I. By the end of it, it was just a shadow of its former self. And most of all, the war radicalized a whole generation of Europeans. After seeing the horrors of modern war firsthand, nothing seemed off limits anymore. Empires were swept away, and that left a vacuum. Fascist and communist dictatorships filled the void. Societies were entirely unprepared for modern machine warfare, and that meant they were also unprepared for the soldiers who came back from the war. Shell shock afflicted countless returning soldiers. It's now called PTSD, and we have a much greater understanding of it than they had then. There were over 15 million deaths in the war and 20 million wounded, and it transformed every aspect of society, as if all the hopes and dreams of modern civilization came crashing down. In fact, the great truths of Western civilization seemed like nothing more than empty promises. Of course, this all had a dramatic impact on art. The whole notion of progress, which was the promise of modernism, seemed kind of like a lie. The war ended in 1918 with the Treaty of Versailles. The short-sightedness of the victors of the war proved to be one of the biggest blunders in history. In Europe and the Middle East, territory gets divvied up among the victorious nations. The Middle East especially, because it had so much oil and little military might aside from its colonial overlords. Boundaries were carved up out of defeated old empires into entirely illogical designations, with no real regard to tribal or national identity of the people who lived there. This set the stage for regional conflicts that exist to this day. In fact, September 11th certainly doesn't happen if it weren't for World War I. Everything about the treaty fostered animosities that created the perfect conditions for World War II. The terms punished Germany heavily, which really backfired. The crippling reparations ruined its economy and made its people miserable, particularly as the world enters a Great Depression. These conditions cleared a perfect path for the radical Nazi ideology that eventually took over. The Western world tried to prevent anything like the Great War from happening ever again by creating the League of Nations, but it didn't have any teeth, because nobody was willing to give up the sovereignty needed for it to do any good. In addition to the political and social upheaval caused by the Great War, there was a key breakthrough in physics. Albert Einstein's theory of relativity, which was published in 1916, revealed that time and space are relative constructs. This shattered the Newtonian notion of the universe. Even physical reality wasn't a fixed absolute. Was nothing sacred? Out of all this chaos, two attitudes seemed to be prevalent. It seemed there were kind of two ways to respond to everything that was going on. One was to embrace utopian ideals. And this attitude thought that art could be a positive force, shaping mankind for the better. But another response was to embrace an absurdist refutation of Western civilization itself. Artists who subscribe to the first way of looking at things, the utopian one, include the person we're going to talk about next. This is Suprematist composition, White on White, by Kazimir Malevich. This optimistic work arose from the Russian Revolution of 1917, when the Tsar was removed from power and eventually replaced by the Bolsheviks, the beginning of the USSR. This was a time and place where, despite the ravages of the war, the nation itself was literally reborn. They were trying to create a utopian society out of the ashes of the war. Everyone would work for each other, for the common good, rather than for their own selfish gains. And everyone would share the fruits of the nation's labor. It was faith in the possibilities of a new age. To Malevich, this new beginning called for non-objective art that was universal and clear. His concept was called Suprematism. Objects in the world are meaningless compared to pure feeling. In fact, objects only get in the way of pure feeling. What he wanted to create was a universal set of symbols that everyone can relate to. Here's a quote by Malevich. Under Suprematism, I understand the supremacy of pure feeling in creative art. To the suprematist, the visual phenomena of the objective world are in themselves meaningless. The significant thing is feeling, as such quite apart from the environment in which it is called forth. He goes on, the suprematist does not observe and does not touch. He feels. The square was a basis for the forms he used in his painting, similar to Plato's idea of the forms. He believed in the universal appeal of the image and the purity of shape and color to communicate visually. In his work, we see floating shapes, rectangles and squares, sometimes bright colors and dynamic compositions. There's subtlety, simplicity, elegance, perfection, truth and beauty. But, it didn't actually really end up working out that way. Once the war ended and the Soviet ruling party took control of every aspect of life, the experiment with an idealistic communist nation was over. The new dictatorial regime had little use for artists like Malevich and their arcane philosophies. They wanted practical art, and Suprematism was anything but practical. Some European artists didn't buy into the idea that art could do anything for civilization. Civilization was already dead and gone. These artists became part of a movement known as Dada. One of these artists is particularly important. In fact, maybe the most important artist of the 20th century. I suppose I might have said that with Picasso already, but here he is. This is the French artist Marcel Duchamp. Let's look at a somewhat earlier work of his, because by the onset of World War I, he was already a forerunner. Here is his Nude Descending a Staircase from 1912, 2 years before the war started. There's a conscious reference to motion. He was influenced visually by the Futurists, but not by their mentality at all. He was even more influenced by the Cubists, and also by the camera and recent experiments with the moving image. In 1913, this work was brought to New York and exhibited in the iconic Armory Show. This was the first introduction of modern art to America. It was described by an American critic as an explosion in a shingle factory. In not a very nice way. You might be seeing a pattern. Most all of the significant art of the modern era was ridiculed when it came out. Then years later, people eventually catch on. And America at this time was in particular a cultural backwater. After World War I, it becomes relevant economically and politically and a little bit artistically. But its biggest artistic contribution will come after the Second World War. Anyway. In 1916, in Switzerland, which was a neutral country during the war, a group of artists and writers, including Duchamp, called themselves Dada. They started meeting, discussed all the issues raised by the Great War. Their conclusion was society itself is to blame. They realized some things. Number one, the universe is patently absurd. Number two, any civilization where mass mechanized killing for tiny gains of real estate could take place is broken beyond repair. By this time, the war had been going on for 2 years with no end in sight. Number three, worse still, the majority of people went on unquestioningly with what their leaders said and did. Bourgeois culture had grown rotten to the core from corruption and complacency. So, what to do about it? While artists like Malevich thought they saw a way forward, Dada simply pulled the plug. Society itself must go down the drain. It eventually would have to be replaced with something, but one thing at a time. So in essence, everything must go. Dada was anti-tradition, anti-religion, anti-government, anti-schools, anti-everything, and especially anti-art. So how does one go about being an artist if they're anti-art? The answer? Ridicule the very institutions of art. Duchamp takes the most iconic image of the Western art tradition and defaces it. He drew with pencil on a color reproduction of the Mona Lisa, classic goatee. And there's nonsense and wordplay in the title as well. If you sound the letters out, L-H-O-O-Q, in French, it sounds like you're saying something to the effect of, she has a hot ass. Sort of like how in English the phrase, if you see K, spells out something. Humor is an important component of Dada. Why? Well, they were influenced by a relatively new set of ideas, one that didn't even really have a name yet. Now we call it existentialism. The basic gist of it is the universe has no inherent meaning. Whatever meaning we see is constructed by man. And this is the concept of the absurd from Nietzsche, we talked about before, and other European philosophers of the time. What What can you do when you're confronted by the absurd? They chose to laugh in the face of Western civilization, the horror that was the Great War, of the institutions of a society that could permit such a thing. There's no other authentic response. Perhaps Duchamp's most lasting legacy is the invention of the ready-made. He decided that if you took an everyday object and put it in a gallery to change its context, voila, you've got art. Sure, it was a joke, but it had a deeper level of meaning as well, almost despite itself. The ready-made questions the very nature of art. Let's look at another one. The fountain. He took a urinal, turned it on its back, and put it on a pedestal. As we've said before, he was already a well-known artist at this point, well-regarded. He belonged to the Society of Independent Artists and submitted this work in secret to the show that they were putting on, and signed it R. Mutt. You can see the signature there. But nobody knew who did it. There were rumors it might have been him, but the committee refused to include it in the show, despite the stated policy that said every single submission would be included. Here's a reaction by another artist who happened to be a friend of Duchamp, even though she didn't know it was him who made it at the time. Whether Mr. Mutt made the fountain with his own hands or not has no importance. He chose it. He took an article of life, placed it so that its useful significance disappeared under the new title and point of view, created a new thought for that object. There are a lot of possible layers of meaning with the name R. Mutt and the title of the fountain. What Duchamp said about it, here's another quote, quote, "Mutt comes from Mott Works, the name of a large sanitary equipment manufacturer. But Mott was too close, so I altered it to Mutt, after the daily cartoon strip Mutt and Jeff, which appeared at the time and with which everyone was familiar. Thus from the start, there was an interplay of Mutt, a fat little funny man, and Jeff, a tall, thin man. I wanted any old name. I added Richard, which was a French term for, like slang term for money bags. That's not a bad name for a pissotiere." I think I pronounced it right. Get it? The opposite of poverty. But not even that much. Just R. Mutt. But is it art? What is the magical thing that makes the art object different from everything else in the world? Is it craftsmanship? Well, no. There are plenty of skilled painters who make crappy art. Trust me. Well, then, is it taste? Maybe, but sometimes that seems a bit empty and frivolous. Duchamp's answer was context. The artness of an object depends on the way a person sees it. Any object placed in an environment where it's looked at as art takes on the same significance as art does. From Duchamp again. A point that I want very much to establish is that the choice of these ready-mades was never dictated by aesthetic delectation. This choice was based on a reaction of visual indifference with a total absence of good or bad taste. In fact, a complete anesthesia. It becomes art if it's experienced as art. It's the act of the viewer that makes the art. Dada artists like to use chance and free association of images to allow them to step outside Western tradition. This piece on the right is called "The Bride Stripped Bare" by her bachelors even. And this is a great example of the use of chance and randomness and the absurd. Complicated work, these forms arranged in between two panes of glass. As they were movers were moving the work into a museum, they dropped it on accident and it shattered with cracks running all the way through it. And most artists would be devastated, but Duchamp thought it was amazing, and it was finally the perfect touch to the piece that really made it feel complete. Eventually, Duchamp just decided to quit making art altogether. It was kind of a logical extension, I suppose, of Dada philosophy. He played chess instead. In fact, there's another famous quote by him, but don't know the quote exactly. So to paraphrase, he said, "The only good reason for anyone to make paintings anymore is to get high on the paint fumes." Another artist associated with the Dada is Man Ray. Here's his assemblage sculpture, The Gift, from 1921. Turning useful things like an iron and nails into something completely and utterly useless. Collage was another medium that the Dada were attracted to. Here's Hannah Hoke, cut with the kitchen knife, Dada through the last Weimar beer belly cultural epoch of Germany. If you think about the act of collage, it does fit kind of perfectly into the Dada mentality. You cut out these images and radically change their context and meaning by rearranging them and putting them in different situations. It's the perfect, a natural fit with Dada. By incorporating elements of chance, the Dada artists were especially influential on the next important art movement. One that in many ways was almost an outgrowth of Dada itself. Almost maybe like Dada who decided to keep making art. Surrealism. As a group, the Surrealists mostly included writers, but artists were a big part of it too. They were led by a writer named André Breton. In a lot of ways, Surrealism was the spirit of Dada fused with the ideas of Sigmund Freud. Freud revolutionized the way people thought about their innermost selves. Many of his ideas seem dated and discredited now, but his theory of personality is still a widely accepted concept today. To Freud, the self is like an iceberg. Everything in our conscious awareness, like our thoughts, memories, the inner dialogue we have with ourselves, these are all just the tip of the iceberg. A vast majority of who we are is submerged beneath our conscious awareness, the unconscious self. So if you want any real insight into who you are, you're not going to find it in the realm of your conscious mind. You need to probe deeper. Remember the existentialist call to live an authentic life, to be your true self without the burdens of societal expectations? Well, how the hell are you going to do that if it's inaccessible to your conscious awareness? According to Freud, understanding the unconscious mind can happen in two ways. One was through your dreams, as they don't subscribe to any of the arbitrary taboos of modern society and allow you to act on these inner desires that you wouldn't even give yourself permission to have at all in your conscious mind. Another way was through your interpretation of random events, the way people are wired through Gestalt perceptual tendencies to see bunny rabbits in the clouds or faces in the moon. These interpretations of chance are another way to bypass the conscious mind and access the deeper unconscious. Dada's inclusion of chance makes sense, but for Dada, it was sort of nihilistic. The whole point is that it's meaningless. But the Surrealists saw meaning in these things. They made something novel and significant out of it. Here's part of their manifesto, written by Breton, that sums up their philosophy, sort of a definition of Surrealism. Pure psychic automatism, by which it is intended to express verbally, in writing, or by any other means the real process of thought's dictation, in the absence of all control exercised by reason and outside all aesthetic or moral preoccupations. Working in the absence of any control exercised by reason, exempt from any aesthetic or moral concern. In drawing or painting, this meant spontaneous mark making.
and then interpreting the results as the imagery was developing, and then responding to those interpretations. Free from rational control, no pre-planned imagery. The artwork begins to take on characteristics based on those on-the-fly interpretations. It was improvisational art, much like the jazz musicians that were so popular at the time. True creativity, living in the moment. Exquisite Corpse was a surrealist game, and it was done either through writing or drawing collectively in sequence. Sometimes it's blind, where the previous image or written passage is covered from view. And then other times you can see part of what the last person did. But once you've done your part, you pass it to the next person. If you look really closely at this slide, you can see that it's folded into 4 sections. If you look really carefully, you can see the fold marks running horizontally across the surface, dividing it into 4 sections. And you can see where one drawing would end, the next person could see just how that drawing ended and nothing else, and they could extend it up until when they're done. And then the next person could extend that, and so on. And so you have this drawing that creates this continuous image, even though nobody knew what came before it. Automatism was the perfect way to free yourself from the contrivances of the conscious mind and get at the unconscious level of the self, the truest self. Here is Giorgio de Chirico's Melancholy and Mystery of a Street. We see unique combinations of imagery. It's sort of bizarre, but strangely familiar, like something you may have seen in a dream. Long shadows when the sun is getting ready to set, and these long shadows loom over small figures. There's a sense of foreboding, a desolate atmosphere, even though it's set in a city. It's almost sinister. The empty trailer, why? And the perspective is kind of funny too. The whole thing is shrouded in mystery with a disorienting sense of space. And you can see the shadow of a figure in the space between the buildings, just about to round the corner. Kind of spooky. But it's Salvador Dali who is probably the most famous of the surrealist painters. His aim was to materialize images of concrete irrationality with the most imperialistic fury of precision, in order that the world of imagination and of concrete irrationality may be as objectively evident as that of the exterior world of phenomenal reality. He was significantly less automatic than a lot of the other surrealists, and so he did kind of plan out his imagery somewhat. And it has a much more representational look. In fact, there's quite a sense of precision in rendering forms that are not real and can never optically exist. Here's one that you've no doubt seen before, The Persistence of Memory. And this is a really small painting. It's only 9 by 13 inches, which is unbelievably small compared to pretty much everything else we've looked at almost the whole semester. There's a strange, bleak landscape populated by these flaccid objects, clocks and dreamlike imageries, maybe the suggestion that time has ceased to pass, maybe in some ways a response to Einstein's notion that time itself is relative. A strange floppy figure seems to be sleeping. You could see the similarity to Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights that we talked about a little while back. The ants eating away at the timepiece, perhaps suggesting that nature will ultimately take over. Is it anxiety about time, the passing of time, death, perhaps? But this sleeping figure here, is it maybe referencing a dream state, or maybe time being suspended in sleep? All sorts of different possible things this painting could dredge up out of the subconscious mind. I'm in no way dogging Dali. He was my favorite artist, as he no doubt was and is to many other adolescent boys of a certain predilection. but his work has been so co-opted that it's almost hard to take seriously. Miró was another Spanish painter whose works have perhaps held up over time more than Dalí. Miró didn't consider himself directly associated with any one art group, including the Surrealists, but he embraced the idea of chance in art. He started his paintings by making a collage of free-form shapes that he organized. These shapes had multiple associations, and they became black silhouettes as the painting evolved. The process was intuitive, based on the workings of the subconscious mind. Perhaps ironically, Breton considered Miró to be the most surrealist of them all. His works were filled with whimsical, dynamic, expressive movement. And here is Merritt Oppenheim's object, Luncheon in Fur, from 1936. It was comprised of a fur-covered cup, saucer, and spoon. It was the incongruous object, thwarting expectations of the viewer and mixing sensory experiences in a disorienting and somewhat troubling way. Her work set up strange juxtapositions combined in a single form. It was dreamlike, and the tactical quality of fur gave it a softness and sensuality. So this is where we'll stop for today. In our next lecture, we'll shift focus across the Atlantic to see what's going on there in the early 20th century. Thank you for joining me.